in looking at this review of this conference is what I call a budgetary slush fund trick. When I served as mayor for the City of Dayton, I inherited a city that had not balanced its budget in 5 years, and we had to immediately balance it. And one way that we did so was by finding those slush fund budgeting tricks. And this trick was actually something that we saw in the city, and that is people were taking vacant positions and they were cannibalizing the money and using it for items that did not have the same level of scrutiny. The money would not be, if they came forward and started with a budget proposal that had what they were actually going to spend the money on, it would never pass the test of scrutiny. But by keeping vacant positions open, they could cannibalize the money and use it for purposes that have a lower level of scrutiny and then accomplish things like this outrageous conference. Could you speak to that for a moment? Because in the city, we prohibited this practice. What we did is we said if you have an open position, those funds can only be used for personnel, and if they are not used for personnel, that they are recaptured and actually go back into, essentially for us, the Treasury on the Federal side. I'm concerned in seeing this that this must happen across the board in the Federal level, and there's probably hundreds of millions of dollars that could be recaptured if we recaptured vacant position funding. Could you speak to that, Mr. George?
Yes, Mr. Turner, and then I may defer to my colleague, Mr. Coots, to elaborate. We did look at this issue. The money that was expended by the IRS in terms of the unused money that was otherwise provided for hiring of enforcement officials, it was going to last if the IRS had not completed the hiring process by the end of the fiscal year. That money would have been returned to the General Treasury. And so they did have an incentive, and it's in some ways some people consider it a perverse incentive, that spend money before it goes back to the Treasury.
See, what we did in the city is we said you don't have that option. If you have not hired people, if these monies are not being used for personnel, the money goes back, period. So you don't get this slush fund that they used to do this conference.
There are instances when money is limited to the sole purpose for which it was first appropriated. But in this instance, that was not the case. And I think I'm going to now request that my colleague.
Yeah, real briefly, this is part of the small business self-employed. They're part of the enforcement appropriations account within the IRS. This money was essentially transferred within that appropriation, which we determined was not a violation of appropriations law.
Well, I want to take this issue up because I think certainly I've seen on the local level how it makes a difference, and we certainly need to do it on the Federal level because I'm certain across all Federal agencies there have to be these slush fund pots that don't meet the scrutiny level that if the funds had been requested for the purpose that it ultimately spent would have been denied. Mr. Fink, we have what we understand is the swag bag from the event. This says leading into the future, and then we have a portfolio that says teamwork in action. These items, like 3,000 of them, were given to all the participants, over $60,000 of these types of trinkets. And listening to the ranking member who was so eloquent about the issue of how these are taxpayers' dollars that are taken out of the pockets of people who work very hard for their monies. We note in the footnotes on what was in these swag bags is that it also included, and I'm kind of confused by saying this, a plastic squirting fish. And I've been asked several times by the media who've taken a look at this, what purpose could the IRS have in giving the participants a plastic squirting fish? I think it goes to what the ranking member was saying, part of the party atmosphere, that this clearly was not for business and government purposes, that it was a party. Could you please tell me, what were these items for, and why would people get a plastic squirting fish?
Congressman, as I mentioned, I honestly have no idea what the plastic squirting fish was. That's just being honest about it. The items that you referred to there in the bag, as I mentioned earlier, and it's in the Inspector General's report also, when you look at the expenditures that were done for those items, we certainly, as an organization, should not have spent those funds.
Thank you. Mr. Fink, I hope you understand the irony of taxpayers who hear you saying that you can only account for 90% of the expenditures because they would never stand in front of you and be able to do that. I yield back.